Okay, today is the Father's Day episode. I am going to detail everything that I can remember about my relationship with my father. Keep in mind that most of it, up until teenage years, is going to be from the perspective and the memory of a child. That's the crazy thing about going back and remembering things like this, especially whenever you go through trauma as a kid. You have to deal with just so much bad stuff that you can block it out. I tend to do that. One of the things that I've been trying to do is just remember stuff and take note so that the memory is more clear. I've noticed the more I think about it, the more I focus on a certain event, it starts to unpeel a bit. But it's weird because there's some that you can't shake that they might not have been real. Like, could you have dreamt some of this stuff? Or is it buried so deep that your brain has convinced you that it didn't need to be real just so you can unburden yourself a little bit? I don't know. It's very strange. But I just wanted to put that kind of disclaimer before I started that a lot of the memories are that of a child. Things that I remember as a kid. I've typed out as many memories as I can about my relationship with my father. I wanted to share it with everyone because it fits in with what I do here. I've talked about him to some extent so far, but this is kind of the front to back. Might be a lot of information, too much in some cases, but I'd rather do that than not give any at all. I started this thing out being completely honest, so I apologize if I'm a little quiet. Right now I've got a sleeping 7-year-old in the other room, so I'm trying not to wake him up. My earliest memories of him were that he wasn't there. I only got stories about how great he was. I can't remember exactly where my mom said he was or what he was doing, but she was definitely trying to make him sound great. It sucks when you learn the truth, but you can't really fault her for it. I understand why she would do something like that, but the damage it caused me throughout my life, you'll see here, because it was just a pattern. Because I guess deep down, I was still 3 years old thinking, he's great. No matter what he does, there's still good there. I have to give him another chance. I would later find out he was in rehab and running away from the law due to warrants. For what, I have no idea. The rehab was for drinking, which he does now, so I guess that didn't take. My earliest memory of him actually being there is when he showed up to a birthday party at Mazio's Pizza. I believe he stuck around long enough to take a picture and then he left. I don't really remember being around him much there. I think it was around this time, too, that I was with him. It feels like on weekends. He lived in this decent apartment complex. I remember him dragging me on dates. Of course, at the time, I had no idea what it was. Even when I was just hanging out in some stranger's house entryway, doing nothing, until he snuck out in the middle of the night and, surprisingly, would wake me up to go too. That's nice. One weekend, he got me a dog. I was in love with this dog. I had always wanted a dog as long as I could remember. It was like a little bloodhound puppy, and it was adorable. And I think I still have a picture of it. I probably don't, but I know there was a Polaroid. He took a Polaroid of it, probably because he knew that I wasn't going to be able to keep it. I brought the dog home to my mom's after the weekend was over. She promptly made me give it away. I think he knew she wouldn't allow it, and I was just a cog in their shitty game. He was physically abusive, but his abuse of choice was definitely mental. A lot of guilt-related shit. Early on, it was just fucking with me, making me rewatch the same scene in a horror movie over and over, even though it was obviously freaking me out. Around this time was when he met his second wife, who looked exactly like Ozzy Osbourne in the 1980s. No joke. She had a daughter who was probably 6 years older than me. On weekends, I was over there. They'd go out all weekend and leave me and the now stepsister home alone. She'd watch The Lost Boys and Labyrinth a lot. No real complaints there, and she also taught me the fine art of prank calls before the invention of caller ID, so that was pretty fun. I don't remember why, but it was probably me still thinking he was great. Seriously, those early onset tales of him really fucked me up. Around this time, I'm 7 or 8, I guess, I go to live with him. They live in this house directly across the street from some train tracks. I remember them distinctly because later I would get a kitten. For some reason, the kitten would eventually walk across the street, make it across the street, onto the train tracks, and a day later, when I would go to find him, he would be in 2 pieces. A few months later, he started getting work in Galveston, which left me there with Ozzy and her daughter. At one point, it just happened. Every day after school, as soon as I walked in the door, I was to sit down at the table and write the same sentence over and over for hours. When I was allowed to stop, I got to do any homework I had, whatever I needed to do, eat, bathe, and go to bed. Dinner every night, without fail, was a kid cuisine frozen dinner. Have you ever seen those? I can't look at them without getting heated. There was a 15-minute drive from the school to the house. Her daughter and I rode home with some other kids. This van had a small TV in it, and if I was lucky, I got a few minutes of Tiny Toons in before I got home. I seriously looked forward to school. I couldn't stand the thought of having to go home. I was still under the impression that my dad was a good guy, too. Even though he was buying whatever Ozzy was selling, she would tell him how awful I'd act, and he'd believe it, and I'd get shit on. It was awful. Sure, I guess it's not real abuse, but doing that for 6 months to a year was pretty terrible. I wouldn't do that to my kids. I think it was that summer we went to visit him in Galveston. This was the first time I remember him hitting me. He got pissed off about something and punched me in the side of the head. Soon after, I went back to live with my mom. This is when she was seeing her boss, the one I spoke of last episode that was an abusive drunk. The short version, for anyone that didn't catch that episode, is that he exposed me to the idea that my mom could be beaten, and that there was nothing I could do. He taught me that I could be beaten as well, and there was nothing I could do about that. These were frequent lessons. This is a man who had a family that he lived with, but my mom, who was also his secretary, was his side chick. He got her pregnant, and along comes my half-sister. After not pulling herself and her children away from this monster for so long, something clicks and she finally does, and we go to live with my aunt, who is her younger sister, for a little bit. I think that ended badly with my dad the last time, because I can't remember why I left, why I went back to live with my mom. I remember when I moved back, he and Ozzy would drive up and down my street, talk to me until I cried because I couldn't go with him, and then take off. What the fuck is that? Oh, you know what? I just remembered something. I was in some form of the Cub Scouts at this point, and he was supposed to take me. He shows up while the alcoholic boss was there, and somehow they get into it, and the drunk decked the fuck out of my dad. Terrifying then, funny now. I laughed. He ran off. I think he was crying. I didn't go to Cub Scouts or whatever it was. Dude got punched and left. Great role model. Speaking of, many, many years later, he would confide in me that he and Ozzy took the very SUV they would sometimes come to the neighborhood in to some giant field, set it on fire, report it stolen, and collected the insurance money. Again, great role model. I can't recall when this fits in the timeline, but for a spell they lived in a trailer park, and of course as a kid, you think that's the coolest thing. Hell, I still look at it fondly. Except the beatings. He was pretty physically abusive then. It was always me. That ended up being a reoccurring trend with him. Always me, never the new wife and kids. At least while I was around. I can't say what happened when I wasn't the scapegoat. I hope nothing happened. I'd like to think nothing happened. I think after the house by the train tracks, we moved to a cul-de-sac. More beatings and mind games. The beatings weren't as rough anymore. A lot was pushing down, flipping you over the recliner, that kind of stuff. It doesn't leave proof. Funny how it was in such a shitty environment, but I still think back to a birthday I had there and love it. It was a favorite. We went to Mr. Jim's Pizza when it was a restaurant and it had 3 arcade games. I played the hell out of Double Dragon 2. I loved it. He took me and 3 friends to see RoboCop 2. then back to the house, and I think the friends got to stay over. One of them gave me Goonies 2 for the Nintendo. During this time, he was throwing away letters, cards, and packages from my mom. This is another spot I can't recall what the catalyst was to my leaving, but after this time, I'm fairly certain I wouldn't see him again until I was a teenager. At that point, he had left Aussie and was with another lady who had 2 kids. I was 14 or 15, end of the 9th grade, and moved to his house because I was making some really dumb decisions at my mom's house. For instance, I became friends with this guy who was probably in his 20s and was selling stolen video games for him at school. Really. After I moved back to her house, I would find out this guy crossed the wrong person and ended up getting his head blown open. That could have been me. I think about that all the time. So I lived there, and I remember it being overall good. His new wife was nice enough. The kids were fun. We all had our own issues and way of doing things that tended to clash but wasn't a big deal. This is when he started challenging me to fights. If we were out alone, or occasionally he'd just drag me outside of the house, he would push me and actually tell me to fight him. He would call me a pussy because I wouldn't, and I'd start crying. Not blubbering, but like confused and upset. I couldn't understand why this guy wanted me to punch him and start a fight. It made no sense. I never did, by the way. I just couldn't. I've always had an issue with fighting someone I considered a friend or closer. It just doesn't make sense, and I guess my brain can't process the betrayal. So yeah, he did this and laid guilt on really thick. Saying someone made you feel guilty 10 hours a day doesn't sound that bad, but god damn, it takes a toll. It really wears you out, and it really, really stays with you. So I'm there until I just can't take it any longer. I moved back to my mom's, and I stay there until I graduate high school. I don't see Scott again until I'm in my early 20s. We try to get along, and anyone that knew me could see how thrilled I was to have my dad around. No matter how many times he fucked me up, I always welcomed him back. I always wanted that dad. The dad he should have been. He liked to remind me about how his dad beat the shit out of him as a kid. So why didn't he try to break that cycle? Was I not important enough to him? My kids were important enough to me. If I so much as try to guilt them, I second guess myself, and if it's anything like he did, I hate myself for a day. He got me a job at his employer, a very small steel die shop. It would have been great if we never had to work together. It could be good, but as soon as he got pissed at me for not catching on to something quick, or if I just said something that crossed him, he'd drag me outside and try to get me to fight him. It was ridiculous. In fact, just thinking about this, like just saying that, he dragged me outside and challenged me to fight him, it sounds so ridiculous. But I remember just hating it so much because I wasn't going to fight him, and I didn't want to fight him. Maybe he knew that, and that's why he would do it. God. Garbage. After I had enough that time, I was done. I didn't want anything to do with him ever again. I was an adult now and could make that choice with my eyes completely open. And then I met my wife, and we had a child. That's when she tried to nudge me into talking to him again. I didn't want to. I had enough. But she didn't understand my lack of desire to keep family around, and I sure didn't understand why someone like him was important to bring into. So with the rule being, as soon as he fucks up, we're out, I contacted him and we started talking. He was divorced again and cried about being lonely. I was suckered right back in. It worked well for a bit. There was still some bullshit guilt, but that was the extent. He was happy to know his grandson, and I felt okay, even with my guard up. Then he met wife number 4, another widow with children, which proved to be a trend for him. Far worse this time. He hit hard with the guilt, and when it came down to it, he started basically ignoring his grandson and treating my wife and I like second-class people to these new family members. They were it. They were the new favorites. We were old news. Our heart broke for our son, but we knew what we had to do. I told him, one chance. There was no way I was going to let him yo-yo in my kids' lives. No way. And that's how it's been. We cut him out and haven't looked back. He probably knows our second son exists, but He's never met him, and he never will. Happy Father's Day, Scott. Thank you for showing me how not to be a dad. Before I end this on a sad note, there is a silver lining to the story. I think I was 11 or 12 when my mom started dating who would eventually become my stepfather. I had a hard time letting myself like him, but I think I was 16 or so when one of his lifelong best friends sat me down and set me straight on what makes that man tick. That's when I understood him and respected the hell out of him, knowing that's the type of person I should aspire to be. Even after their divorce, he maintained that my half-sister and I were still his kids, and his side of the family has been nothing short of my family since we met decades ago. My kids are his grandchildren, and he's as close to a father as I've ever had or would ever really want. Happy Father's Day, Del. I love you.